Hello and welcome to this @Summits. Today we're going to get the CISO's take on cloud data security. I'm Jack Poller, Enterprise Strategy Group's analyst for data security. Joining me today is Bernard, Rahul, and Amer. Bernard, why don't we start with you, introduce yourself to our audience.
Excellent, Jack, thanks for having me. Bernard Brantley, CISO at Corelight.
Excellent, and Rahul?
Thanks for having us here. I'm Rahul, I'm a head of security at Sigma Computing, and I'm in this industry from the last 17 years, led many security positions from Fortune 100 to startups, and excited to share the floor with all you guys.
Excellent.
Thank you, Jack, for hosting us today. Amer Deeba, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Normalyze. We are everything about data security in the cloud and on-prem and SaaS, and excited to be here to talk about this topic with everyone today. Thank you.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you all for joining me. I think the first place I want to start with is really to understand our environment. We talk about data security. What exactly is it that we're securing in the environment? What's our environment look like? And Rahul, why don't we start with you and say what's your take on what the environment looks like?
So currently, if you see, the data is actually moving all across the borders, especially if you see the data is going through different cloud environment. So that become a lot of sensitive information which security leaders have concern with. You don't know where your data is going, how your data is protected. You really need to understand the posture of your data. So the environment overlook look very critical, and to understand in more deeper wide session, it's so much important for us to understand what are the risks associated with that, where my environment will be taking me in the next 3 to 6 months or time frame, and how can I protect that. So the environment is cloud specific for me, and which is very, very critical. Being a CISO of organization, I need to protect that.
And Bernard, do you have a different sort of view about that, or?
No, I believe Rahul's hit the nail on the head. Environments are dynamic and ever-changing. As a CISO, my responsibility is to ensure that the environments are in a functioning state to support the business and that the data that lives within them is protected. I think about data as the primary reason that a business is able to do what it's successful in, and then from an attacker's standpoint, there is no value to an attacker without the data that sits within those environments. So essentially, all of the controls that we are implementing, all of the processes that we build as a security organization, the role of the security organization, the security team, is really focused on protecting that business relevant data from adversaries, as well as protecting our customers who may entrust us with hosting their data.
Well, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. I've often said that I think the challenge the security industry has is we focused, we've had 30 or 40 years of tools. We did infrastructure security, network security, endpoint security, and along the way, the means became the end, where we say now we have to have an endpoint security solution. But from the bad guy's perspective, the attacker's perspective, it's all about, I need the data, I'm trying to get the data, wherever it lives, however it lives. So, Amer, from a data security protection vendor perspective, what's your take on what the environment looks like?
It's definitely now multi-cloud is a reality for every business we're talking to and every customer. So whatever you do, you have to make sure it works across multiple cloud environments. Digital transformation, especially in the last couple of years because of the pandemic, accelerated that move to the cloud and various clouds and various acquisitions happening at the same time. So we see data spreading everywhere. I mean, it's just all over the cloud. The data is eating the cloud, is eating the world, in fact. So that part is becoming now more critical for businesses to understand where the data is, to start at least getting that visibility and that control that they lost when they had it all on-prem under their own control. So it's really a significant problem for many security companies and teams that they're trying to solve. So.
When I think about the cloud, one of the things that strikes me, particularly the difference between the cloud and on-prem, if you think about an on-premise environment, it's fairly static. An IT administrator probably can go and look at it and say, hey, there's 5 or 10 storage boxes, there's 100,000, hundreds of spinning disks, 17 databases, and I know exactly where everything is. I don't even need to write it down, it's all in my head, right? It's a little bit different in the cloud, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you had control when you had it on-prem. You knew where it was, you knew who had access to it, or who can give you access to it. it moved to the cloud and you lost all these trust factors, or they changed. So they're different trust factors. If you move your data to a platform as a service, for example, environment, you have no control there, and how the data is moving and who has access to it because of all the changes happening and the frequent changes happening in the CI/CD cycle and the fast development of applications as it moves between in the QA environment or the pre-production to production. All that data is moving around with you, and it's just right there. There's a lot of risk factors that comes with it that you need to better understand to make sure it doesn't get compromised.
So, I mean, is that your perspective as well? I mean, from an outsider's perspective, I think about it as that there are that data is not only moving around in the cloud, it's getting created very quickly, right?
Yeah, I think you raise an interesting point. There's data that's being created very quickly. There are essentially three classes of data that I think about when I'm focusing on my environments. It's what is the data that we own or that we're entrusted to own?
Right.
What is the data that we're creating? And what is the data that we're managing? And each of those has a little bit of a different context when it comes to what's the impact to the business on the security model around this data or data governance. And you know, it's really important to get a foothold on those three separate classes as well as where it lives when you're thinking about how do I protect these certain environments. There's an underlying set of processes that goes around governance and security and data that we're creating, which may be separate from data that we're managing, which may be separate from data that we're owning as a custodian.
Right.
But at the end of the day, the requirement to know where it is, what's in it, and how the security risk is shaped around it is extremely important.
So what types of threats are you guys facing in terms of data? What do you think about? Do you think about a specific type of attack or classes of attack? Or how do you think about protecting your data and the threats you face?
I think the way data is exploding, threat vector is also exploding in the same way. And with the advancement in the technologies, there's always an advancement in the threat vector as well. So if you see cyber attacks ranging from ransomware attacks to phishing attacks, insider threats, all those are prevalent in the cloud environment. And that becomes so much highly important for any organization to secure, to ensure like you have sufficient guardrails to protect against those threats. And we should not even miss another important threat, which is your privacy obligation.
Right.
Because the way things are expanding across the globe, there's a very critical component to maintain those privacy obligations. Otherwise, there's huge penalties. Forget about those threats through adversary. Even something happens through an insider threat, it can really put you into bad shape. So those threat actors are not just used to be on-prem, but somehow which is transferring to on cloud. But on top of it, because we don't know where the data lives, the threat actor become much more vast, where we really need to put our pedal on the gas at a higher speed to get those fixed things done. So I think threat vectors are same, it's just how the threat landscape is changing. And the MLA model, the way it is changing, you see new attack vectors. So you really need to ensure you have a better guardrails to protect against that.
I think he raises a great point that we need to expand as security practitioners, expand our thinking beyond the threat as a threat actor vehicle and threat as a threat to the business, which is exactly spot on when we talk about privacy requirements. There's a great threat to the business in incurring some financial penalty based on your misuse or mishandling of data, almost in excess of what a cyber event may cause you from an overall business harm perspective. So it's very important that we're thinking about both sides of the equation, the business side where it comes to privacy and things like GDPR, CCPA, as well as thinking about how do we consider protections against the adversaries and adversarial context that we have in both hey, we're a supply chain vehicle to customers that we may be protecting, or hey, we're a direct target of certain adversaries for whatever reason.
I'd like to add to that. I mean, I 100% agree with both Rahul and Bernard. The concept of shadow data now, that's kind of a new a new threat phenomenon we're seeing in cloud environment, because it's data that has sensitive information, but you're not aware of it. You're not aware it exists. You're not aware who has access to it, what type of access they have, and what type of sensitive data it contains. And it could lead a lot. I mean, we've seen already very public exposures related to that. Somebody created a file database, moved it around, while developing the application, left it behind. All of a sudden, there's a vulnerability behind it, or a threat, or a risk factor that leads to compromise of that data, and becomes a big deal. So we especially working with customers, that's kind of like a requirement that everybody is trying to get visibility on right away. So it's the fear of the unknown, what you don't know in your environment, that could really expose you for something big. So.
I'd just like to pull a quick thread. If you think about some of the headlines around breaches lately, it's not XYZ company got hit and suffered 25 minutes of downtime, or 3 weeks of downtime. It's 5 million customer records exposed, PII data released to the public internet. So this concept of understanding exactly where that critical data lives, understanding the privacy context of that data, and understanding where it may persist, in Amer's case about shadow data that may persist elsewhere that you weren't aware of, it's extremely important that we get a hold of where those things live and a route to discovery.
Well, I think the visibility, the discovery that's a problem endemic to all of cybersecurity, right? But especially to data, it's that's sort of, and I think you touched upon it early on. That's the critical asset that we're really concerned about. I also liked your framing of it as not a threat to the business, right? Which is a different approach and a different way of thinking about it. And you're right, a lot of these things we don't think about it that way, but it could be a minor problem, a minor incursion that still is an existential threat to the business because of the financial damage or the reputational damage, right?
Exactly.
And I think also, if you think about it, that discovery part is much harder also when it comes to data, because data is very diverse, it's very different, especially in the cloud. You have structured, unstructured, all type of forms and formats that are popping from, and that could vary from one cloud environment to the other. So it makes that discovery part a lot more challenging, and of course, having the right framework to do it well and to do it in a multi-cloud environment becomes very critical for organizations.
Right.
So.
I think when you touch base on this discovery part, Amer, one critical piece to even understand here is, in an organization, when we talk about discovery, people try to spin up so many different instances in different cloud. It's so difficult to understand whether those accounts are managed or unmanaged. In those unmanaged environments, if someone really have those kind of sensitive information, it's so hard to detect that. Unless and until we have a good discovery mechanism, we can't even bifurcate or segment our environment. Wait, which is my managed environment, which is my unmanaged environment, which is my sensitive environment. How I can, really segregate those things and then at least add my guardrails on top of it, because every guardrail is not going to protect my environment in the same fashion. I need to put extra effort on protecting my sensitive data, need to spend my money on that area, which really means to the business, instead of spending my money somewhere else. So discovery really, really important in managing the entire framework for the organization.
And that's how we see it also actually with most customers. I mean, that's kind of the number one priority, is getting that visibility on a continuous basis, so you really you know where you start and where to prioritize and how to kind of get started.
So Rahul, you brought up something else that we sort of passed over, but I think is very important, and that's the insider versus the external threat, right? And the cybersecurity industry has spent many, many years focusing on the external threat, and we've got all of our great marketing with the bad guy in the hoodie, right, with the dark background, but there's a tremendous amount of risk and threat and data loss that occurs from insiders, right?
Yeah. So if you see that way, at times insider threat is not always intentional. It could be unintentional as well. If you may have seen in the recent attacks, people are just alert fatigue is there. That's the reason industry is talking about fidelity alerts, like high fidelity alerts should be there. Otherwise, because of those alert fatigue, people take some action which they might not require to take. And because of those factors, data get exposed. And similarly, there could be few people who are not motivated enough in our company. You even need to cater those needs and understand how you can protect your data from those people. And then the important thing comes into play is the identity identity, how you ensure who access the data, how you can ensure how those identities can be monitored, can be protected, so that even within the organization, your data is protected from those people who can somehow become a bad actor for the organization.
Yeah, you mentioned an important part in the unintentional piece to insider threat. And we've all got acceptable use policies that have data classification, what employees are supposed to do with certain types of data, but if we don't have a solid path to identifying where that sensitive data lives and then ensuring that we have policy enforcement and controls around how that data is accessed and used, employees unintentionally will share data sets which may be sensitive or materially impactful to the company with no knowledge that this is actually a sensitive data set that you're sharing. Right? That hey, I've got a developer who's looking for a data set to build code against, and for whatever reason, those attributes leak into source code that ends up in someone else's hands, and it was purely unintentional, but nobody had actually classified it or structured controls around it, telling them that it was sensitive, and now it's somewhere else. And so, that we keep touching on discovery, but identification of that thing that you consider sensitive, and then ensuring that your policies and controls are kind of wrapped around those things in a way that's clearly understandable and accessible to all the employees of the company in line with your acceptable use policy. There's only one route to that, and this is the emergence of data security. Like, it's unintentional that data security is the path to kind of like asset inventory, doing a data inventory and building the right things around it, but it's absolutely where we need to go.
Yeah. And I mean, I echo that, and that's why we think, when data moves within the environment, you also need to track it. That's just the way it is. You're discovering it within the environment. In a static mode, you need to track how the data moves in the environment, where it starts, where it ends. They call it the term for a data lineage, like why, especially if it's sensitive data, why all of a sudden I am in a database, a financial database, I have HIPAA data there or PII data that shouldn't be there. How it got here, and was that intentional, and what along the way who had access to it? Because that doesn't just help you, of course, from a compliance standpoint and exposure to different regulatory frameworks where to make sure you're clean, but also in case of a breach happens, you want to know what happened along the way and how that data moved within the environment. Right. So it's kind of the concept of detection and response, just so you really understand the flow of data within the environment, and you can get alerted for data exfiltration, misuse of data is moving around in a way that it shouldn't, against your controls or against the security framework that you've already established.
Right. So we've talked a little bit about it sort of implicitly or tangentially, but let's talk a little bit about sort of what makes the cloud different, and why don't security tools, what options did you have, and what security tools work and don't work?
With movement to the cloud security provider has taken, the cloud provider has taken a strong stance in there are native tools available to make this easy. Right. And there's a belief that what the provider is doing is either good enough, or there's a path to leveraging that cloud provider to do some of those fundamental things that either just doesn't exist or isn't refined enough to give you indications for your specific environment. Where in the on-prem world, like, I know I need these things. I know I've got to go out and do this type of scanning. I know I got to put in these types of controls. I know I have to go buy a solution to do X, Y, and Z. In the cloud, it's almost inferred that, hey, AWS is doing VPC flow logs. They're probably doing something for my data. I can go find these things very easily. And then you get to the reality post-breach that, hey, that doesn't exist. Or, I really have no path to aggregating up all of my S3 buckets and what's in them, short of doing my own scans, which is extremely troublesome. So how do I go solve this problem? It's one of those things you don't think about up front as you're making the transition to cloud, but you quickly find out when you start trying to apply policy and controls in the cloud that there's a delta between what's there and what we need.
Absolutely. I think just to extend on that, if you see in the cloud environment, which is highly complex anyways, there's a requirement to ensure we are meeting the dynamic nature of the cloud environment. The workload moves really fast in that environment. The way computing is easily expanded and it's scalable, you really need to have solutions which are also scalable alongside with that. It should not be like, we just only can trust the native solutioning, but also we really need to have those solutions which can really collaborate better with them and can give you that visibility and understanding, yes, my data is secure, my data is protected, and I have the visibility around that. Even if you see those on-prem devices and environment, it really can help you to a certain extent, but over there you have much more bandwidth to control those environments, but cloud environment is outside your boundaries. People will be accessing that environment from wherever they are going. As Amer mentioned, in the last few years, digital transformation is happening. So because of those factors, you really need to look into those avenues which can really cater the need. And for that reason, on-prem is not going to solve the existing problem in the cloud world. We really need to look into different solutioning.
Yeah, I'd add one more thing to it. API is the new network. Yeah. So in the on-prem world, right, you have fine-grained control over what transits that network. In the cloud, it's all API-based with services that don't have clear definitions or clear documentations. Now, if you've ever gone and tried to investigate a CloudTrail log and you've seen assume role and you're wondering, what is sts.amazon.com and why is it coming from this IP address? I got to go deconflict that. Sometimes you have no idea what services are accessing your data from where, and it's all, basic functionality that's baked into how the cloud operates, but it's completely opaque to you as an end user. And without, that same level of control, or you don't know that you need to go shape specific policies within AWS, Azure, GCP to restrict these things, it's a whole different ballgame. Where you thought that you had, I'm moving from on-prem where I've got full fine-grained control over the network, I can do this with firewalling, I can do this with a host firewalling, I can do this by API definition on the endpoint. It's just not the same in the cloud.
Yeah, I mean, it's that whole freedom in the cloud to build, to create quickly also gives you complexity, because there's a lot of diversity of the environment, and especially when it comes to data, you could just put it in 10 different forms of data instead of just one, like the way you had it on-prem. So that ability, I think, to innovate fast and quick comes with a price, which is you have a bigger diverse environment, and you try to do it across a multi-cloud environment that just gives you, that triples, quadruples the complexity level and what you need to do to secure it.
Right. So I think, and Bernard, you talked about one thing which I think, from my perspective is the shared security model, shared outcome model, right? And do you think, from the CISO's perspective, do you think that the shared security model is working or not?
That is a great question. I do believe that it's working. I believe that some of these base assumptions that we make about security of the underlying operating system, that we make about security of the network, the way that we configure it, AWS will shut you down in some way, shape, or form if you're making bad security decisions, particularly around like public S3 buckets. They just by default turn that off, right? You can be on-prem and mistakenly open something to the internet and have no idea about it until you get popped or notified. The shared security model ensures that what folks like Amazon or Azure understand and see as best practices around security are automatically applied, and they put some guardrails around how bad you can hurt yourself. Right. So I'm appreciative of that. The area that we get into trouble is, where does that boundary live, and what do I need to do on top of it? And that is sometimes, again, opaque to the end user. You think that the cloud provider is handling this, but no, it's really your responsibility. Or you think this is my responsibility, but it's actually being handled by the underlying service definitions in the cloud provider's default setting. So I believe it's working as a short answer.
I think, yeah, absolutely. It is working. It's a shared responsibility. We can only take something for granted. The baseline will be provided by them, but on top of it, you have to build your infrastructure, you have to build your services, you need to make sure the misconfiguration should not happen. You need to make sure the way they are providing the services, it should be well embedded with your backend. But yes, in the earlier cases when these type of services, AWS, GCP never existed, there will be much more work, much more laborious work need to be done by the infrastructure people. Now things are shared. We are getting at least the best practices through them, and those best practices are working across the industry people. So definitely it's a blessing for the organization where we can at least do some work, but at least something we can be not responsible for.
Right. And do you also feel that the dividing line of what you're responsible for versus the CSP, is that clear and well articulated, or is that still an issue?
I think it depends on organization to organization, at times based on your implementation as well. Things, when you start implementing, you feel like, hey, it's clear. They are going to be infrastructure security will be maintained by them, platform will be maintained by me, but that's not the case. Because once you start implementing, they are at the end providing your platform. You can make some mistake in that platform as well. They won't be responsible for that. As Bernard mentioned, if there will be something we are opening as a S3 bucket will be just exposed, public S3 bucket would be there, they will be at least notifying you. If someone is trying to attack on their DDoS attack would be happening, they will be notifying you. But at the end, you really need to define those guardrails and your benchmark. That's the reason we always rely upon CS benchmarks, NIST benchmarks.
Right.
There need to be having strong standards in our organization through which we can develop our platforms.
Mm-hmm.
And it's definitely having those standards is helping organization get started faster and quicker. But you really, at the end of the day, you really need to know what you're building and
right.
how you're taking it into the cloud, and where the controls that you need to have in place, and what you should depend on yourself versus the CSP themselves too. CSPs now are providing a lot of tools that can help you get started fast and quick, but it's also one cloud, one dimensional. So if you're building your environment and your application in a multi-cloud facet, it becomes much harder to do that.
Right.
And therefore that's where you need to take a step back and put the framework that can allow you to go multi-cloud faster and quicker.
Right, so as a tool provider, as a third-party tool provider that's solving this problem, right? And I think Rahul, you brought up, and even Bernard brought up things like the open S3 bucket case, right? And there's a new tool category that we talk about, CSPM, Cloud Security Posture Management, that theoretically addresses these conditions, these situations. What's your view as a cybersecurity tool provider about CSPM, and where does that fit into cloud data security?
It's an infrastructure security basically focus, right? That's focusing on securing your infrastructure, and it does a good job at that. But at the end of the day, it throws a lot of alerts at you. Going back to the fidelity of alerts that Rahul mentioned, where do you start? Instead of, if I'm getting 1,000 alerts today, are these all important? Do I need to pay attention to them? Where I take my remediation efforts and focus it? Because we're all seeing how the resources, especially from a security perspective, are very overwhelmed. So this is where I think taking the extra step and focusing on the data and where the sensitive data is and what the attack paths around it right. can be huge in terms of really prioritizing your efforts to fix the problems, the important problems first, and it gives you a much better path to remediation rather than just starting with everything you have and trying to figure it out that way.
Right. As CISOs, do you think about CSPM, and is that something that's important in your data security strategy, or do you really still rely on the service provider for that?
So if I could, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but CSPM is a great first start. Mm-hmm. Right? If I think about the movement into cloud transformation or digital transformation into cloud, what's most important to me? And getting a clear view of the landscape, understanding where I may have deltas between best practice and how I'm supposed to be architecting things, understanding how my policies are built, where they live, that is kind of like the initial landscape analysis that needs to happen. So it's important, but there are more important things and more important problems to go solve.
Okay.
So I think I just have a little different opinion here. And in some cases, CSPM help. In some cases, it just sends a lot of noise. Mm-hmm. Because it totally depends on your implementation, because CSPM is driven through some specific standard, whatever you choose, based on your organization need. And if some check really fail, as per the CSPM, you are not doing good. But as a matter of fact, your implementation suggests you are doing good, because maybe I created some security groups, which is needed for my business. But CSPM is like, no, this is not required. You really need to shut it down. Maybe AWS, if you go to AWS marketplace, they're like, hey, we can really take you out of this because you are not maintaining CSPM, CS benchmark standard, whatever it is.
Right.
But yes, we are maintaining everything, then you need to keep justifying that. You need to provide all the justification why I'm doing these things, because certain exception can always be there. As Amer mentioned, because there are some alerts which may not be relevant to me, but may be relevant to someone else. By the time you really need to take a common ground and then need to pivot from there, which is going to be helpful for your business need. So it's totally depend on the business to business, but yeah, definitely it's a good starting point to build a good strategy, at least around the infrastructure.
Right. So then, the new kid on the block, sort of the parallel and corollary to CSPM for the data side is DSPM, Data Security Posture Management. So Bernard, what's your take on that? What is DSPM and how does it help or hurt you?
Yeah, so I mentioned CSPM as a start point.
Right.
DSPM is moving closer to the finish line.
Okay.
So if you think about CSPM with a purpose, the purpose is data, which is the most important object within our infrastructure or within our organizations. So if I think about what's the overall value that I get from a CSPM-like architecture, it's all right, my policy is good, I've set up my accounts in the right way. If I think generally about what my overall cloud posture looks like, I can go verify and validate against that to say, yes, we're deploying properly. But when it comes to why I'm securing these environments or how I prioritize how I secure these environments or what's in these environments that I need to protect, that focus on those data objects and thinking backwards from the object to the posture is that evolution that's required, and why, again, I mentioned CSPM as a good start point. DSPM is where we need to be to evolve our security programs and think through to what's really meaningful to the business and what's meaningful to attackers.
Right. And that brings us back sort of to your early concept of thinking about the threats as threat to the business rather than just an attack, right?
Yep.
Do you have the same view of DSPM?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's definitely the end goal where really it can address some of your key problems inside the cloud environment. The CSPM can give you that baseline, but DSPM give you the actual context. That context matters when you really try to fix some problem. You really need to understand in the world where you are, most of the teams are lean teams with security, how you can start working only on the things that matters to you. And that can only happen when you can classify your problem in a much more structured manner. When I say classification, it's mostly on the risk prioritization, how I can prioritize those risks and at least relate that risk to a context. And context could be the identity, the person, the access, and then I can really convert that into a complete attack analysis. If I can create that end-to-end data flow for my organization, that is my end goal. Like CSPM definitely can help me with the configuration, but what is happening inside my environment, I have no idea. Maybe CSPM can say, hey, this repository is open or this S3 bucket is open, but does it mention to me like this access control can really lead to some other lateral movement inside my organization which can lead to data risk of some of my PI information that cannot do. So we really need that end-to-end context to protect the environment. So yeah, that is really helping the industry in moving into that direction.
And so, Amer, from a DSPM tool provider, right? One of the challenges you mentioned with CSPM is alert fidelity and alert fatigue. So how does DSPM sort of address that challenge?
It gives you that additional context, which is where the it ties everything to sensitive data, basically.
Right.
So that's, it starts, the main use case of it is discovering and classifying the data, and then, but it goes on to tell you where the data is, what's everything around the data, what type of access is around the data, what type of configurations or vulnerabilities are around it. So then every alert you look at takes into context the value of the data it's protecting. And that value allows you to prioritize better, to address important threats better. And also when you do remediation, you have kind of that end-to-end context of that threat. So you fix it, you don't just fix one part of the alert, you end up fixing it beginning to end, so to secure the sensitive data at the end of the day. And I think that extra context is an empowerment to security teams and to cloud security teams, because it gives you the full path to secure what's important, which is our job as information security professional is to secure the information.
Right.
And I think that's kind of what we're all trying to get to accomplish at the end of the day. So.
Well, now both you and Rahul mentioned, this end-to-end concept. So, and particularly for Rahul, when you think about this, how do you think about and build and select and develop an effective framework for securing your data? What's a framework look like? How do you think about it?
So I would say there's no defined framework. Actually, it's totally depend on the business, totally depend on the business need, the security requirements, privacy obligation, what I'm trying to solve here. Once I understand those requirements, I really need to conduct a posture assessment. I conduct a posture assessment, understand my risk, understand my vulnerabilities, and that is going to drive my next steps. So then it becomes my security requirements. The security requirement could be about where my data live, where my data is stored, where my data is processed. And then based on that, I need to start building my controls on that. Based on all these requirements, then I need to see what will be my framework. People try to say my security framework is NIST, say yes, I control. You can adopt those things as a baseline. But based on your business need, you at times need to create a custom framework, use something as a baseline, create something customized, then try to implement it, make sure all your controls are implemented for making sure your security requirements are met. And then the most important thing is continuously monitoring that.
Right.
Because if we miss that monitoring part, that is going to really fail us off. And then the last thing is, which I always believe, any framework is really incomplete without coaching and providing the right security training to your organization. Because that is really, really critical. Whatever framework you build, if your team is not supportive, if your organization is not supportive, because security is a team game, you really need to make sure before any threat actually become an attack, they need to notify you as a security team.
Right.
And then you can really take, be ahead of those attack vectors. So that is always a framework. It's totally depend on the nature of the business. If you're working in financial or wherever, you need to pivot accordingly.
I don't know that it's so much an established framework, more so the usage of some of these common standards of how to implement security generated by NIST and some others. Right. So in my organization, we think through overall risk assessment. That can be a number of different things. It could be business impact assessment, threat assessment, product security assessments, and or pen tests. There's numbers of others there, but that's really how we discover and surface risk. We also do threat modeling exercises to understand what risk may look like, and then it's a matter of applying the CSF, right? The life cycle of the security operations, which is moving from identify those risks, how do I generate and create protections against those risks, how do I detect where those protections may fail, how do I move into my response activities, and ultimately how do I recover from certain activities that are detrimental to the environment or need remediative action. And then it's about picking a controls framework to implement those things in. And for us, it's NIST 800-53. There's a bunch of others out there, ISO 27001, but as you mentioned, there's no set framework for how to do it, but there are established frameworks for different areas of the overall security program that we can borrow from as we think about how do we do this for the data piece in our environments.
I'd like to call like a best practices approach in a way,
Right.
So, and what we see with customers, basically, they start with the first thing, discovery, of course, and classification, so they know where everything is. And then from there, they move to enforcing least privilege access to the data. So, if you have access to a database for 6 months, but you haven't touched it for the last 6 months, why should you have access to it, especially if it contains sensitive data, right? And then from there, moving to the risk factors, so trying to understand where the risk is and remediate it in an automated way or semi-automated way with your DevOps teams. And then the fourth step is compliance, which is really adhering to a certain framework of compliance framework that allows you to say, okay, do I have a GDPR exposure or PCI exposure or HIPAA exposure, again, depending on your business. So that approach, and to be able to do it in a multi-cloud environment across structured and unstructured data, and to understand also the data in motion component, is sort of where kind of the best practices customers are starting to follow to really secure the data kind of in a comprehensive end-to-end way. Yeah.
So I want to take the conversation in a slightly different direction real quickly. We got a few minutes left. So far, none of the three of you have mentioned sort of two buzzwords that are all over the expo hall here at RSA. And what do you think I'm going to ask you?
Is it a chat bot?
Exactly. So one is ChatGPT AI, and the other is zero trust. So let's actually start with the more serious one, which is zero trust. How does zero trust play for you in data security? What do you think about it, and how does it work for you?
It's a path to the data that I am securing. So it's less about zero trust as a theme or zero trust as an overall architecture. It's how do I construct the posture around my sensitive data to limit the availability to an adversary, employees that shouldn't have it, or to systems that shouldn't be talking to it. And that's just, it's an extension of zero trust, but I'm not chasing down a true zero trust initiative. I'm saying how do we isolate and control sensitive data within the environment, and by design it ends up looking something like zero trust.
I think that's definitely a buzzword. Like even if you see from the last year, it is still continuing, and it started with some specific platform, and people are using it at all level right now.
Right.
But yeah, I agree with Bernard here. It's more like a philosophy than a framework or a technology. How you can build that philosophy into anything. It could be how you ensure your corporate is secure, how your data is secure, or even when you authenticate to different layers of a environment, how those authentication is happening. So it's a philosophy that you keep building, and it's a framework that you can just adopt in any organization.
Right.
So I don't believe it's need to be implemented as I have implemented ZTNA as a technology, but can you implement it as a philosophy? That's the matter of fact.
Yep.
I throw this in there. Zero trust is micro-segmentation by another name.
Okay.
That's true.
And I think data security posture management is a kind of sort of a best practice for zero trust. Building a zero trust type of a framework. So it goes well together. So
So with the last few minutes left, let's start with you, Amer. What are sort of your top 1 or 2 or 3 takeaways that people should think about when they think about data security, and what's the most important things we should be thinking about?
That now there are really good options for you to get started quite fast and quickly, and to get that visibility that you need. Don't wait to the last minute until you have a breach to do it. Take the proactive approach to build it into your security framework, and start like both Bernard and Rahul. Make it a center point in your security practice to like not get breached, and then after that go after it. That would be the and then how to get started. There's now many options that you can do that. Start with visibility, as I said, and getting that discovery and understanding where things are, and then from there prioritize remediation and next steps, and kind of just go from there. So.
And Rahul, what's sort of your key takeaway? As a CISO, what would you tell other CISOs?
I think security is nothing but a risk-based approach. You have to take certain risks. You have to understand those risks first. And to understand those risks, you need to have the visibility. Then again, it's a round-robin situation. Now you again come back to the visibility to identify your risk, so that I can build my approach. So yes, as Amer mentioned, you really need to build a good visibility platform. How you can understand those risks related to data, risks related to my infrastructure, risks related to my compliance obligation. Once I have all those things enabled in my environment, I'll be in a better position to understand what risk I can take today, what risk I can mitigate, what risk I can accept. Based on the conversation with your board, then you will be in a better shape. Otherwise, CISO life will be over, because you can't mitigate or remove everything. You really need to understand what is a good start, and for that matter, visibility is a key phase.
And Bernard, I guess you get the last word here on key takeaways.
The key takeaway for me is that it needs to be a focus for security practitioners. And that is for a couple reasons. The first is that there's a constant back and forth about how does a security team represent value to the organization or value to the business. And it's much easier to have a value conversation around data than it is to have a value conversation around network, equipment, endpoints, identities, right? It makes the conversation much easier to have with the other members of the executive team, with the board of directors, to translate, this is why this positioning is valuable. The second is that as you think back to what we're really entrusted to protect, there's only one thing. Why aren't we taking more of a focus and putting more effort on protecting that one thing, which is the data that we're holding as a company. So if it's not a focus today, the takeaway is that make it a focus.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's excellent, and I'd like to thank you. I mean, I learned so much about this. I love your, the data is the key sort of formulation from all of you. So I found this very entertaining, exciting, and interesting, and I hope our audience did too. So I'd like to thank you, Bernard, Rahul, and Amer, and I'd like to thank our audience for joining us. Thank you very much.